Okay, so have a little look at Matilda's essay here. I spent about 25 minutes messing it up the first time round, so we'll see how it goes the second time round. So first of all, we'll just have a little look at the opening paragraph here. Now this is quite dense. I think one thing we're going to say with essays is you can sort of summarise what you're going to do at the start. And in a way this does that. It's got some stuff on the baskets of goods here. It's got some stuff on the fact that the basket of goods is weighted. And it's got an example there with matches and petrol telling us what weighting is, and it's got a little bit on the difference between the CPI and the RPI. So in some senses, that sort of presages all the things we'd expect to find in the essay later on. The bit I was a little bit surprised about was, very early on here, I was expecting to find something just telling me what inflation is. It's always some easy definition marks in part A of the essay. Okay, second paragraph here I found a bit clumsy. It's definitely right that anything based on an average basket of goods isn't going to be unrepresentative. Is going to be unrepresentative of some households unless you consume things directly in the proportion that the basket of goods has the things in it in. So it's not just that an unrepresentative household doesn't buy all the items in the basket of goods. It's still the basket of goods wouldn't work if they bought all the items but bought them in different proportions. I might have made that a bit softer and a bit more accessible by talking about a student basket of goods and a pensioner basket of goods and just giving some simple examples, so a way of getting the point across in perhaps a slightly easier way. Okay, so this paragraph here, this one we're going to look at here, this is about a problem with the RPI and the CPI. So I quite like that, but I'd expect it to be last. I'd expect to go through the whole way it's calculated and then to look at its limitations. So what's the correct paragraph is perhaps not quite positioned where I expected it to be. Okay, again, very complex paragraph down here, arguing, in economics this is called endogeneity. So basically it's saying that mortgage rates are included in RPIX, but then RPIX is used to set the mortgage rate. So there's some sort of methodological issue there. It's endogenous. Your mark determines how well you do, but how well you do determines how confident you are and determines your mark. They're affecting each other. That would be a sort of poor economic model. Again, it's a problem with the process. I'd like to go through the whole process and then have these paragraphs on problems with the RPI and the CPI at the end. So they're slightly out of position for me. Then down the bottom here we've got a bit on weighting. So in terms of order, I'd have gone defining inflation, which is missing. I'd have gone something about the basket of goods, which we do have at the top. It's fine, although it's expressed in a slightly more complex way than was needed. I would then have done weighting, so I think this bit should have been nearer the top. And then had the sort of problems at the bottom. So very, very sophisticated, very well written, no grammatical mistakes, no incorrect economics there, slightly strange order, slightly theoretical rather than example based, but generally most of what we need is there. Ticking it off against a mark scheme would be a different way of marking it, and I'd have to say how many individual points are made. But that's a good answer. I say that's a grade A answer, but not a perfect answer. So, grade A is 12 to 15, I guess, on part A. So I might be thinking that's a sort of 12, 13 mark answer. So on to part B. So to what extent is inflation preferable to deflation? Again, I'd probably just start with very basic definitions of inflation and deflation. Certainly deflation, if I got inflation in the first part, but this goes bang in. Which again's a strategy to summarise your argument and then outline your argument in depth, but possibly I would have gone for those slightly easy marks at the start just to make it easier for the examiner to give you some credit for doing not very much. So this bit here on deflation, all technically correct. The only thing I'd say about this is very theoretical argument. No relationship to a real world situation. Japan's had deflation. Abenomics in Japan, very famous example of a government trying to deal with deflation. I'd like to see some reference to that there. This paragraph here on the wealth gap is good. deflation means that the value of wealth will go up. So if you hold large amounts of wealth, deflation is brilliant for you. Not so sure about this next paragraph here. I mean, deflation would mean the value of wages rose in real terms. I would probably have discussed the value of wages rising in real terms, and this leading to firms wanting to employ less workers. Also the fall in demand as people wait for prices to go down, reducing AD and causing unemployment in that way. I probably wouldn't have argued up front that deflation was going to reduce wages when we know, the primary and initial effect is that the real value of wages would increase. So nothing wrong here, but perhaps slightly unusual way of tackling things. I think inflation is less likely to increase inequality. Inflation would erode the value of savings, so people with large amounts of wealth and savings will actually find their money's worth less, and poor people who didn't have that obviously won't have their savings being devalued. And we know in Britain in the 1970s we had up to 28% inflation. It reduced the value of savings, and then the middle classes and pensioners who'd lost their savings voted Mrs Thatcher in 1979. So this suggests that inflation probably reduces inequality and the rich get very unhappy. Most inequality is in wealth, not income, and so wealth, the value, the wealth of the rich will be reduced. In terms of income, everybody's income will be affected equally. So if you earn twice as much as somebody else and there's inflation, you still earn twice as much as someone else, so there's no change in the distribution of income there. Okay, the bit on debt here is good. I mean, inflation does reduce the value of debt, so debtors gain. Quite like the bit at the end, so it says, Britain has a strong financial economy, therefore we do lots of lending abroad. So if we have inflation, it's actually not all that good for us because the people we owe money to pay us back in pounds worth less, so they've gained at our expense. So I quite like this. It's the first reference to the British economy. I feel with deflation we've got no references to world economies, and now finally we do have a real world example. We've got a bit on anticipated inflation here, not being too bad. Double prices, double the value of everyone's wage. As long as everyone's completely rational, anticipates every change, there's no effect on the economy. That's what we call the money as a veil argument, right? Money as a veil for things in the real economy. The trouble in the real world is adjustment mechanisms mean that money rarely operates in such an uncomplicated way. This bit here is at the heart of the answer. Inflation might seem to be a bad thing, but it's usually associated with AD going outwards, usually associated with economic growth, Q1 to Q2. Probably better to use Y here. Q makes it sound a bit like a microeconomic diagram or on a macroeconomic diagram. Similarly, I'd probably call these P1 and P2 just to show I know we're doing macroeconomics. And then we've got to quite a brutal conclusion. Inflation and deflation both have issues. Inflation's preferable because AD is going up. So this is correct, but it's quite brutal and quite an abrupt conclusion. So overall, I think this is entirely technically accurate. All the economics in it is correct. I think all the spelling is correct. I haven't seen any spelling mistakes, any errors with written English. The diagrams are correct, although not that directly linked to the text. What could be better? I think we need more real-world examples. It's a very, very theoretical essay. It's written about inflation and deflation without referring to any world events. We know we've had deflation in Japan in the last 20 years. We had a little bit of deflation in Ireland post the Eurozone crisis. Inflation got very low in Britain, but we didn't actually hit deflation post 2008. Equally, inflation, we know it's been very high in Zimbabwe. We know it was high in Germany post World War One. We know it was high in Britain in the 1970s. I know there are lots of examples that we could have brought in there. So we're missing real world examples a little bit. And in terms of evaluation, we've given an entirely correct textbook type account, and we just want it to sound a little bit more evaluative to enable the examiner to put it in the very highest mark band. So we could use very obvious tactics at the end of each argument to say to evaluate, to evaluate increased aggregate demand has the benefit of increased national output and increased employment, but the problem of inflation, which is more important, depends on where the economy is at that point in time, how near we are to capacity, whether we're on the vertical portion of AS, something that sort of relates it to context. So everything there's correct. I like the correctness of it. Probably just needed a little bit more in terms of real world examples and evaluation to give it the very highest mark. So I'd say certainly a band 4 mark. Band 4 would be 17 to 21 at 25. Probably needed just a little bit more to get 22 to 25. So I might be looking about 2021 for that. And I did say about 12, 13 for the first part. So that's looking sort of 33 out of 40-ish, 80% odd. Certainly an A grade essay. Just little tweaks required, I think, to make it an A star grade essay. More real world examples, more emphasis on evaluation. Just a slightly less brutal introduction, slightly more referring back to the question, just to show that you're answering the precise question asked and not writing something out. Overall, good effort though.